Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ruth Edwards, Member of Parliament for Rushcliffe. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Conservative Environment Network's webinar here on restoring global nature. We hear a lot about COP26, but there are actually 3 international summits this year that will be critical to the future of our planet. A month before COP26 is the UN Convention on Biodiversity, or for those who like their acronyms, CBD COP15. And then in August, we have the final Intergovernmental Conference for a Global Oceans Treaty. The stakes really couldn't be higher. We know that wildlife populations have fallen by 2/3 since 1970, and 1/4 of all species now face extinction. And here with me to discuss how the UK can demonstrate international leadership at these summits, how we can secure a stretching set of biodiversity targets and a strong global oceans treaty, I have an all-star cast. I've got Lord Zach Goldsmith, International Environment Minister, His Excellency Malik Amin Aslam, Pakistan's Federal Minister for Climate Change and Special Assistant to Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan, Sajid Javid, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, who put in place the parameters for the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity, Kate Norgrove, the Executive Director of Advocacy and Campaigns at WWF UK, and SEN's International Ambassador Stanley Johnson, a former Conservative MEP who's won numerous awards for his work on the environment from Greenpeace, WWF and the RSPB. I'm going to ask each of our panellists to share their ideas with us for a couple of minutes. And I know Zach has to leave at past, so I'll then give him a few minutes to respond to points raised by other speakers before opening up to your questions. So Zach, handing the baton to you. What are the UK government's ambitions for these critical summits? How can we secure ambitious targets, both in Kunming and also a strong global oceans treaty?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And I apologise that I have to leave after half an hour. I'm not going to rehearse all the gloomy facts and figures because by and large we know them. I mean, you mentioned 1 million species facing extinction. I'll just mention one, is that we're losing around the equivalent of 30 football pitches worth of forest every single minute. So if I keep to my time, that's 60 or 90, depending on whether I go to 3 minutes. There's masses of scientific evidence telling us where this path is taking us, but you don't need to be an expert to understand that if these trends continue, we're going to be paying an absolutely terrible price. We've seen in the last year and a half, the pandemic has claimed millions of lives, it's destroyed economies all over the place. But we know, based on everything we know, that the costs of continued destruction of natural systems and destabilization of the climate is going to dwarf the costs of COVID many, many times over. And although we might be able to delay the impact on us a little bit, none of us can insulate ourselves from the effects of degrading the natural world. The poorest will be hit first, of course, because they tend to depend more directly on the free services that nature provides, those services which we're currently grubbing out at the most extraordinary rate. So there's nothing more important than turning this around. We're seeing progress in terms of carbon. I know that's not the purpose of this discussion, but it is worth saying we're seeing progress in terms of carbon. The market for clean energy, the clean energy transitions, racing ahead of the politics, exceeding all expectations, exceeding all predictions, but that's not happening in any way, in meaningful sense with nature. And that has to change because technology is not going to save the day. We can't get to net zero without nature. We know that. Nature-based solutions will provide about 1/3 of the solution, probably a lot more than that, and most cost effectively. Forests, mangroves, so on and so forth. So the UK has put nature at the heart of its climate agenda, rightly so. And on the back of that commitment, we've committed to doubling our international climate finance, spending nearly 1/3 of that climate finance on nature-based solutions, trying to get other countries to do the same. France is now with us on that. We think Canada and Norway and a number of other countries, perhaps Germany, will do likewise. On the back of that commitment, we're creating a pipeline of really exciting new programs, £100 million Biodiverse Landscapes Fund to link threatened landscapes and create jobs for people who live in and around them on a really big scale. A new £500 million Blue Planet Fund, which is a world first as far as I know, helping communities fight off a multitude of threats facing their own ocean environments. We're trebling funding for the Darwin Initiative, we're ramping up our funding for the illegal wildlife trade campaigns, but we're prioritizing forests, and we're building right now a partnership that exceeds by many factors monitors anything that we have seen so far, working with a number of other countries and private sector. The good news is that we know that protecting nature works. You only have to look at Costa Rica. They've doubled their rainforest in a generation, put more than half their country under canopy. They're growing their economy alongside their biodiversity. We know marine protected areas work. That's why we're continuing to grow our blue belt, which is on track, actually not on track, it is already protecting an area bigger than India. We are leading efforts to protect 30% of the world's land and ocean by 2030. We've got, which was signed off today by the G7, we're about to hear in 20 minutes, you heard it first. And in the run up to the biodiversity conference that China is hosting, I think we're doing more heavy lifting than any other country in the world. And what we're pushing for is not just ambitious targets. Targets come and go and governments ignore them, but mechanisms that will hold governments to account. And in addition to that, we're calling for finance, not just public finance, although that matters. We need governments to identify the levers they control to shift the incentives. The top 50 food producing countries spend $700 billion a year subsidizing often destructive land use. If we can get those countries to do what we're doing with our subsidy system, you've got a solution right there. That could flip the market in favor of sustainability. So this is a major part of our COP campaign. And finally, we're using our leverage as one of the biggest contributors to the multilateral aid system, which even despite the cut to ODA, we're still the third biggest donor, to call on the big multilateral development banks to align their portfolios with nature. There's no point them boasting about their investments in nature or climate here and there if the rest of their portfolios take us in the opposite direction. We want them to go nature positive, as we're trying very hard to do here in the UK. And I'll leave the domestic story to others, but we have got an enormous amount to do. No government in the world is doing enough, but we are absolutely determined to step up. We want this to be the year finally we reconcile or begin to reconcile our economies with nature. We want to turn the tide.
Thank you, Zach. Amin, turning to you, can you tell us more about the work that Pakistan is doing to restore nature domestically? And what are your priorities for the negotiations in Kunming later this year?
Yes, thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me to this very interesting talk by the Conservative Network. And it was started off by Lord Goldsmith, and whatever Zach said is really music to my ears. I think we, as a government in Pakistan, really believe in this pathway of nature positive that he just talked about. And I think what we've seen in this really tough times of the COVID is that there is no other pathway possible in the 21st century. We cannot fight with nature. We've tried to do that, and we've seen nature strike back. We've seen the pandemic come up as a zoonotic disease, biodiversity loss, climate change. They're all manifestations of this fight with nature that we cannot win. We have to turn the tide, we have to turn the direction and take a U-turn with nature, I think. The good news is that the world is waking up to that U-turn. I was reading in The Economist just yesterday that there's been this survey done which shows that the awareness about environment from the bottoms up has really doubled during the COVID era. And that's the real push which is going to change things all over the world. And when we talk about building back better, building back green, I think that's where the push is coming from. Pakistan, as you asked about Pakistan, we really in the midst of the first wave, we've decided that this is not a winnable fight. We don't need to fight this fight with nature. We did need nature on our side, and we started what was called the Green Stimulus Program. And the Green Stimulus was basically focused on two things. One is we need to protect nature. The other one is that we need to do it and create green jobs. And successfully, we did that. It had 2-3 parts. The main part was we had this 10 billion tree project going on. We injected more money into it, more focus into it to create as much jobs as possible. And we created about 85,000 jobs for daily wages who were out of job during the lockdown periods. These were people who were putting up nurseries, fighting forest fires, protecting community forests. They were all getting jobs and they're getting paid for it. That really created a big momentum. And we added on to that by what we call the Protected Areas Initiative. This was an initiative to expand our protected areas, create new national parks, and create a national park service to go with it, which could employ our youth into green jobs. So, both these are going on really fast track in Pakistan. They are creating green jobs and they're putting us on a nature positive pathway. I just wanted to take a minute to talk about how do we finance all of this. transition. And Pakistan has tried very different innovative instruments. We launched what was called the Ecosystem Restoration Fund. It was launched in Madrid at the COP meeting, but it really got its first injection of money during the COVID era from the World Bank. We got about $180 million repurposed for nature protection. And that money is going to be injected starting June onwards into, again, activities which will protect nature, also create jobs during the COVID era. We are also going to launch our first green Euro bond, which is going to happen next week. It's a $500 million Euro bond, which is going to be launched for pushing hydropower development into our equation. And thirdly, we are looking at debt for nature swaps. So what Jack just talked about, that they want governments to be actually doing something on nature. We have talked about this instrument of debt for nature swap. We've had some interest from countries, and we are moving ahead with that. I would like to finally, thank the UK government for really giving us leadership with the Dasgupta report. I think it came as a beacon of hope in a time, really challenging time of the COVID. And it really sent a very strong signal to the world that the economic framework which got us to the 20th century is no longer tenable in the 21st century. We need to change that. And we took a cue from that, and we have already in discussion with the UK government to launch a similar report in Pakistan, and we hope to be signing the MOU within the next week to do that. So Pakistan is really on the nature positive pathway, and as I said, we've learned that, and we've learned it, before we got bit by nature, that there is no other pathway for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And staying with the Dasgupta review and turning to Sajid Javid. Sajid, what do you think should be included in the Treasury's response to the review? And how do you think we can encourage other finance ministries to improve their natural capital accounting?
Thank you, Ruth. Thanks for inviting me. It's my pleasure to follow after Zach and Amin. And I agree with everything that they've both said, but especially Amin, you just made the point about the Dasgupta review and the importance of that. And it really is a landmark, seminal piece of work. And I'm glad that the UK has led on that. And let me just explain very quickly why it's so important. I mean, the report itself is like some 600-700 pages long. And Ruth, you've given me 2 minutes to talk about it, and I'll try my very best. But what Dasgupta really brings out is that how our economies, whether Pakistan, Britain, the global economy, we are utterly and totally dependent on nature. Completely, for every single thing we consume, all the food we eat, the water we drink, the houses we live in, the energy we heat our homes with, all of us, doesn't matter where we are, that only exists because of nature. And indeed, as we have this consumption, everything that we consume, also we produce waste, and that all that waste, we are totally dependent on nature to get rid of, to manage properly, so that we are susceptible to less disease and issues of that type. So we're totally dependent on nature. But as Dasgupta has brought out in his report, when I was so pleased to set some very ambitious terms of reference, which he and his team more than met, they really brought out all the facts and figures behind this about how we are consuming nature at an unprecedented rate. And I think he said that in his report that if we just consume at the current level that we have around the world, we would need some 1.6 planets, and we've only got one planet. I don't know another 0.6 planet that we're going to soon be able to have. So we really need to do something about this. And why? Because if we want to even forget trying to improve our standard of living, and of course we want to do that, especially in developing countries like Pakistan, we want to see improved standards of living, but just to maintain our standard of living, there's no way that's going to happen unless we totally change our approach to nature, and we see it very much in an economic light as well. And that's the key to this, is to see nature for what it is an asset. It's a huge economic asset. So think about the economic assets that we're used to, capital, whether it's roads and railways or infrastructure and things like that. We're used to seeing that kind of economic asset. And, that has grown since, I think, 1992. Capital assets around the world have more than doubled, right? Also think of it as human capital. As we invest in our fellow humans, in the skills they have, for example, their intellect, their knowledge, that capital is growing, and that's great to see. We can all do more with that. It helps us not just economically, but in so many other ways. That capital is estimated by Dasgupta to have grown by 16% per person since 92. But nature, if we look at that as a capital, as a natural capital, that has declined by 40% since 1992. So declined because we're consuming at an unprecedented rate. So at the very heart of Dasgupta, what it says is that we must see nature as an economic asset. We must therefore start measuring it properly in our national accounts as an economic asset. And we'll see quickly how it's depleting, and then that will lead to the changes we want to see, the policies, and be able to properly measure them in what we need to do next, which is not just maintain the quality of nature that we have, that natural capital, but also how can we enhance it and grow that with other nature-based solutions or in other ways. I mean, there's a lot more to it about how we measure this in an economy, how we can get the ONS, for example, in the UK or other national statistical organizations to do this. But unless we start treating capital, natural capital, as an asset, as an economic asset, I'm afraid I can't see how we're going to deal with this crisis, this potential crisis that we can properly avoid.
Thank you. That was a very impressive summary of 700 pages in 2 minutes. I'm going to take notes for my next 3 minutes time-limited speech in Parliament. Turning to Kate, can you tell us more about why nature-based solutions and biodiversity are so important to tackling climate change? What more do you think the UK can do to lead by example?
Can I just start by saying thank you, and whilst it's an honour to speak on this panel because of everyone on it, I feel particularly honoured to speak after our former Chancellor, because he was so pivotal to the publication of the extraordinary Dasgupta review. And I encourage you all to read all 600 and something pages of it. So I want to speak briefly about nature at COP15 and 26, and then make 3 points about the domestic agenda, which is so important. So in terms of COP15, the UK has a massive opportunity to lead the charge on a 10-year framework with the mission to reverse the catastrophic loss of nature by 2030. And this commitment is well documented in the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, which Lord Goldsmith ably led with others, and which is signed by over 80 presidents and prime ministers already. But it is yet to be translated into the negotiations, which are happening right now up until the COP15 in October. So that's one thing that's really important. Fantastic breaking news, re the G7 announcement, but there is a difference there between just preserving what we have and enabling nature to already recover by 2030. So that's what we need to get into COP15. In terms of COP26, when talking about nature targets, everyone thinks of CVD, but that's obviously only one part of the picture. The UK needs to help secure greater recognition of the role that nature should play in mitigation and adaptation in COP26. And I know Lord Goldsmith and others are doing lots of work on that. And then the challenge for leading by example at home. To be an international leader, the UK will need to really lead the way, and we are in many ways already. I know that the Environment Bill, long worked upon and long awaited and looked forward to, is coming back next week. We really welcome the announcement on a 2030 species target, and we look forward to seeing more detail on that. For WWF, it's really critical to get the species definition in that 2030 target right, not least to ensure that marine is included, but also to ensure that our overall ambition for it to go beyond just halting the loss and into restoration by 2030 is in there. We need to bend that curve to make sure that we're starting to restore by 2030. A brilliant win there would be to embed the ambitions of the Leaders' Pledge into the Environment Bill by incorporating a target to reduce our global environment footprint and a target to remove deforestation and conversion supply chains by 2023. The second point on domestic agenda is about international leadership. Global Britain could be a really incredible force for good on climate and nature, but that requires us to build world-leading trading relationships that make us stronger and more resilient. We all want the benefits that global trade can bring post-Brexit, but as hosts of the G7 and as presidents of COP, we need to make sure that a bad deal before climate and nature through a bad Australian trade deal doesn't happen. And on this, we should prioritise first, before the Australian deal, responding to the recommendations of the Trade and Agriculture Commission to establish in law a set of core standards for the environment, animal welfare and food safety. And then very lastly, coming back round to where Honourable Sajid Javid started, which is in the economy. In this crucial year, the UK should commit to developing the world's first finance sector that aligns with the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. Major finance institutions are signalling their appetite to move in this direction, but reform must be holistic, needing government to ensure a competitive regulatory framework which will build on the recent Bank of England announcement. So doing that as well would be truly world leading. And we know we're already working well and enjoying working with the government in this agenda and look forward to the next 6 months.
Thank you so much, Kate. Finally, turning to Stanley. Stanley, you've worked at the heart of international organisations. Why, in your view, have previous international commitments to halt biodiversity loss failed? How do you think we can make sure that they're a success and that they're adhered to this time round?
One word, I think, Ruth, is implementation. You know, the words are out there, but we haven't delivered on the ground. Yes, you mentioned my long-standing. I think about implementation. I go way back. It's wonderful to have the Pakistani High Commissioner Amin here. In the 60s, I worked on wonderful energy projects in Pakistan, the Mangla and Talbela Dam. Most extraordinary. I don't think I realized then how important they were. Yes, that is, implementation is crucial. And on that point, for example, here we have, yes, we just had this brilliant, pledge now by the government to put an environmental target in the environment bill. But what is going to happen? Really, what's going to happen is how are we going to make sure we deliver that pledge? And having been years and years working on, for example, the habitats regulation, something like 18% of the land we want to protect in this country is protected under the EU habitats and species regulations. It really worries me that as we leave the EU, we are not necessarily going to have the same kind of mechanism. So I think tough work has to be done just to make sure we do continue to get the right mechanisms there, and that's really tremendously important. Now, the other thing which absolutely strikes me as being a sort of foreign office objective is Brazil. Of course, everybody talks about Brazil, and we've heard Mr. Bolsonaro recently saying he's 10 billion. I think we have to be ready to work with Brazil. We have to be ready to say, look, the money has to be made available, and our team in Brazil has to say to Mr. Bolsonaro, yeah, we are ready to cooperate. I say that I went to Brazil also in the 50s. Look, when the Amazon covered about half the country. Yeah, absolutely vital. These are the things which are out there. And I think that it's wonderful to have a chance, to be here with this wonderful group of people. Implementation. That's the answer to your question. Getting the commitments out there is wonderful, but making sure we deliver them by hard work on the ground, and that has to begin at home. I want to be sure, for example, that we are able to say we've not only promised to get 30% of our land protected, but we're well on the way to doing so, and it's real protection. Well, I don't want to go on because Zach's got to go, and I want to be sure that Zach has plenty of time to respond. Thanks so much.
Stanley, thank you. Zach, a couple of minutes before you go, are there any points? It would be great to get your response to some of those points, particularly around the challenges of implementation and, of course, those tensions with the UK's future trading relationship.
Yeah, so just very quickly on implementation, Stanley's right. I mean, we can set don't forget the New York Declaration on Forests was that we would halt deforestation by 2020. We're still losing, as I said, 30 football fields worth of forest every minute. So it didn't work. So, you can set any number of targets, and if we don't mean them, then nothing's going to happen. The Leaders' Pledge for Nature, I think, is the most radical such declaration ever signed. And I don't just say that because the UK was a big reason it became such a powerful document. And if every country that signed it did what they've signed up to, then we'd be having a very different discussion this time next year. So we've got to ensure that countries do what they're supposed to do. And we are beginning to see that in carbon. And one of the reasons for that, and we really are, I mean, it's not just net zero commitments. We are seeing plans being set out and policies being taken and steps being taken, and we're seeing the market respond in a very, very rapid way. Not fast enough, but much more than anyone predicted quite recently. We don't have that for nature, which is why one of the key things that we need at the next CBD, hosted by China in Kunming, is a sort of Paris-style targets, Paris-style mechanisms or Kyoto-style mechanisms for holding countries to the commitments they make. And even that's not going to guarantee they do what they are committing to doing. So people need to look at the steps countries are promising. Look at the UK. So we're one of the most nature-depleted countries on earth. But if you look at the policies we have in place and the laws we either have or are about to bring in through the Environment Bill, there's a pretty clear plan for getting where we need to get to. I'm never going to be satisfied with it, nor would any environmentalist, but we are moving forward in leaps and bounds. The finance is there. I think one of the most revolutionary things in the world at the moment is what we're doing to our land use subsidy system. We've got the Nature for Climate Fund, £640 million. We're changing the incentives in many different ways. And we've set ourselves some pretty big targets around peatland restoration. Stanley mentioned, I think, that a quarter or nearly a quarter of our land is currently protected, but it's still very nature depleted. So in order to meet our 30 by 30 target, we're not just going to put rings around new areas to knock it up to 30%. We are committed to ensuring that we restore nature in those areas. So we've committed to restoring 500,000 hectares, for example, of wildlife rich habitat. That's not going to be new land that's protected. That's existing land that is going to be properly protected, properly restored. And we will need to be held to account for that. So I know that I didn't answer. There was another question. I'm very happy to answer it, but I can't remember what it was. I'm so sorry.
It was about, just before you go, it was about the UK's future trading relationships. Obviously, I think we're going to see this tension between that carry on.
Yeah, look, this is a tension and probably, you know, a natural tension. So we are already demanding things in our free trade negotiations that have never been demanded before. We put animal welfare as a criteria. No one's ever done that before, to my knowledge. We want to demonstrate that biodiversity, climate, broader environment are considerations that can be advanced, not compromised, through the pursuit of trade. We've announced publicly that every country puts its top 3 priorities in relation to the future agenda of the WTO, and we've put climate change and environment right at the top. No, I don't think any other country has done that. So we mean business on this, and we have a manifesto commitment that we won't allow future free trade agreements to compromise the standards we've set here. And of course, I'm like you, and I guess everyone on this call, absolutely determined that we maintain that commitment, that we honor that promise. And I've seen nothing to suggest. Of course, there's pressure for us to drop that manifesto pledge, of course, and there's pressure actually on us to do the opposite of all the things I was talking about earlier. There's plenty of vested interest that will much prefer the status quo, but I see nothing to suggest that we're not completely committed to the path that we set out. And I know I am as a minister, but I also know that I'm not an isolate within government. I have a lot of support, and there are plenty of other colleagues who are just as committed as I am.
Thank you so much. I'd love to keep you here, not least to grill you on the news from the G7, but I know that you have to go. Thank you so much for joining us, Zach. You appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, carrying on with the Q&A and opening up to some of the questions that are coming from the floor, I think we might continue on that theme, actually, because we've had a couple of questions here around food, diet and better nutrition, which I think is probably aimed at the discussion around sort of dairy and meat farming, and also further questions around the UK's upcoming trade deal with Australia, and other discussions we may have in the future with Brazil and Argentina. So perhaps, Sajid, if I could go to you first, how are we going to make sure that the UK's new trading relationship with these countries doesn't undermine our high standards?
I think the short answer is we don't compromise on our standards. So whether it's animal welfare, the environmental standards, that we ensure that they are part of the deal. And I think that not just because of our biodiversity concerns, but if I link it also to our concerns around the climate, that the future trade deals, whether it's the UK doing them with other developed countries or with different types of economies doing deals, that they're compared to deals of the past, that now is the time to have whether it's we call it a green component, a bio component in all those deals, and just make sure that they are friendly towards those outcomes. Because as we mentioned all these big conferences going on this year and our role in that, but we can see both COP26, COP15, all these countries are taking these issues much more seriously than before. And as these countries, whether we are involved or not, but as countries do trade deals, I think now is the time to set out a template that makes them green friendly and bio friendly, and that can be done.
Thank you. And Amin, turning to you, how does Pakistan handle this tension in its trading relationships?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I've been seeing the conversation we are having on the chat box. I think it's important that we all are not just talking the talk, but are also actually willing to walk the talk. And we need to make sure that, that is happening, because it's very important for the world. As I said, the world does not have a choice anymore. And we cannot have just talk. I mean, we've been talking on the climate change arena for now over 20 years, and there's very little happening on the ground. This cannot be repeated in the nature conversation. And I think countries need to be really putting their feet on the ground and trying to make all these things happen. All the conversation about trade and everything else can follow, but I think it is the commitment by the countries that need to be put to the test and put to the ground, which is really important.
Thank you. That's great. Stanley, do you want to come in with any comments here? I know, Kate, you addressed them in your opening remarks.
Yes, I do. I'd like to talk about China, if I might. Of course, China is the host of COP15. It's more a political point. I just think we have to work with China, and I'd like to think how we can get across some of the ideas we've been talking about today about the ambitions for COP15 better to the Chinese government at a time when, in some areas at least, there's a sort of reticence to deal with China. Do you see what I'm getting at? I mean, I say to myself, of course, I quite understand the reasons for this reticence. Nevertheless, the overarching considerations in terms of climate change and biodiversity are so great that I think we have to find a way through. And I'd quite like to toss this one in if anybody wants to comment on it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Kate, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to say that it's really important to publish exactly what we mean by those standards that were in that manifesto commitment. So the Trade and Agricultural Commission has recommended that we develop those core standards for trade that set minimum requirements for environment and animal welfare. But the government hasn't yet started developing or published those standards, and they need to be published ahead of any Australian deal to make sure that the UK is in the market for high standard food. I mean, Australia has the highest rate of deforestation in the OECD. The rate of tree cover loss rose by 34% just between 2016 and 2018. And that deforestation is largely driven by the livestock industry. So that, although global Britain has to be about trading relationships, it has to be about trading relationships that make us a stronger and more resilient, greener nation, one that's leading in agriculture and the industries of the future, not aligning with backmarkers on climate and nature or making our farmers compete with old models of farming that are still used elsewhere. As that Goldsmith said at the very beginning, we want to be a leading culture and land in terms of the way that we use our land, in terms of the way that we farm, in terms of restoring nature. And in order to do that, we need to say, look, these are our standards that we will not go below on in our trade deals. So we want to have a trade deal with Australia. It's just, let's publish those standards first and then announce a deal with Australia. Let's not align ourselves to people who are working in the past.
Ruth, may I
please do
on one of the points that on the China point that Stanley rightly has raised. I mean, first of all, he's absolutely right in that the world doesn't deal with the challenge of biodiversity and climate change without China. Right? Given the sheer size of the country, the number of people, the economy, its trajectory for growth, it doesn't happen without China. So there are two countries, beyond the UK and the role we play, but there are two major countries, two mega countries out there that are absolutely necessary to deal with these problems. All the others are required as well, but these two, without these two, it doesn't happen. And that is the US. And of course, that's been huge positive development there. Now we've got a grown up back in the White House. It means we can do business. We can all work together on multilateral issues like this that concern the world. And then there's China, of course, as Stanley has rightly mentioned. And I do think it is absolutely possible to have separate conversations with China, and we are absolutely right to whether we are concerned about our security, to challenge them on huge mass human rights violations, and we can do that, and at the same time talk about climate and biodiversity and get things done. I think from everything that we've seen from China, including with President Xi, that they get the risk of climate change, what it means to their own country, let alone the world. Shanghai won't exist soon if the climate isn't dealt with, if these biodiversity threats aren't dealt with. And China wants to deal with them. And I think if we want to point to something positive, quite recent, I thought it was really important and telling that John Kerry was in Beijing recently talking about climate change, preparing for COP26. At the same time he was doing that, we know that the US has been rightly challenging China on human rights issues and other security concerns, but China's having both conversations at the same time. I think that's the way to go, and it can be done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I'd like to just take a minute to say thank you to Amin, who's had to drop from the conversation, but thank you to him for his very insightful remarks. And it was incredibly interesting for me actually to learn what Pakistan is doing in this area. I'd like to move on actually to a question around due diligence and deforestation. Obviously, we have an obligation in the Environment Bill that large companies will be required to address illegal deforestation in their supply chains. But what can the government do to bear down on instances of legal deforestation? How can we encourage greater action without harming diplomatic partnerships, which, as we just talked about, are so vital? Stanley, I thought I might come to you first, given your focus on Brazil in your comments.
But very happy to do that. Yes, I got very heavily involved in the whole deforestation issue way back in 1990 when I was working in the EU. We managed to get the G7 meeting in Houston in May or June 1990 to say it wanted a World Forest Convention, and we tried to get that in Rio in 1992. It didn't get it. It got shot down, particularly by the Malaysians, who ended up with something called a non-authoritative document on forest principles. The point I'm trying to get at is you need to have a definition of what is legal. You might say, well, it's illegal if a government says you can do it. And that, of course, is much of the problem in Brazil as well. A lot of the stuff we don't want to see is nevertheless called legal in Brazil. That is why I think we should absolutely not give up on this notion of really trying to pin down what the legal principles of forestry are. And yes, we've had the New York Declaration. It was tremendously important of 2012. And I would therefore say the next big diplomatic step is to make that soft law declaration into something much harder. So we are able to say, look, it's no good you saying what you do is legal when it simply is clearly illegal in terms of the international treaty to which you have subscribed. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Kate, I know this is something that WWF have worked on because I've been working with your team on the issues. Would you like to give some comments?
Yes, I'd love to. And we need to make the Environment Bill as strong as possible on this point. And that point that Stanley Johnson was just giving us about legal and illegal is really important, because just asking for companies to report on illegal deforestation may cause the sort of perverse incentives that creates weirdly sort of increased deforestation. So as we speak, for example, Bolsonaro is changing laws to make more deforestation legal, and therefore that might mean that we are inadvertently importing more deforestation into our supply chains through including a target in our environment bill that only includes sort of discludes rather illegal deforestation. So those words are extremely important to get right. We need a deforestation target that in the environment bill, and a ratchet mechanism that allows us to check how that target is working. And so that's what we're really looking for in the next few weeks and months in the environment bill. I mean, the important thing is that UK consumers don't want to be buying chicken that is fed on soy that comes from deforestation in our supply chains. I mean, it's as simple as that. People would be incredibly surprised if they realised as they went home from school and went to a chicken shop outside school to discover that actually that chicken is fed on soy which has come from deforested land in the Amazon or the Sahara. So it is incredibly important that we get this right, and that, as Stanley Johnson said, those words on illegal and illegal are very important to get right.
Thank you. Sajid, what's your view on this? Do the current provisions in the Environment Bill go far enough, or do you think they should be strengthened?
Look, my view would be as follows, and just really make the following sort of obvious point, but I just think sometimes policymakers miss it, is that biodiversity doesn't recognise international borders, right? Biodiversity loss, there's no such thing as borders, right? So take what's happening in Brazil, the deforestation, it's the so-called legal deforestation, that it is, and I'm bringing this back deliberately to Dasgupta and what he and his team focused on, is that so much of this is driven by economics, because the real cost of that biodiversity loss is not represented in the economic trades that are taking place at the moment, when someone is taking from that forest and selling those logs, or trying to create profit from that. And what we need to do, and if we properly value natural capital, is because the whole world is affected, we're all affected by that deforestation. It's not just clearly a Brazilian only issue. Then we need to make sure that if we don't want people to do that, maybe it's time now to think about how we can pay to preserve the rainforest. And the economics that are driving this, it all needs to be looked at again. And it comes back to, I think, the point I started with, if I may, is that we need to measure natural capital properly around the world, not just in Britain, and agree international standards in that. And if we can start doing that, then start valuing it properly, then we can understand the economics around it, both incentives to use nature, but also disincentives to preserve, to try and create those disincentives that will lead to the preservation of nature. And there's a lot in the Dasgupta report on this. He actually talks about deforestation in Brazil and gives examples about how the international community could actually raise funds to protect that. But there's a lot to this, but I think it all comes back down to valuing it properly in the first place, and a lot of that is down to natural capital accounting.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to a question now on how do we build on the momentum from the G7 that Zach alluded to in his comments, and the leaders' pledge for Nature Coalition, to ensure we have a positive outcome at CBD. And what does a positive outcome at CBD look like? Kate, can I come to you first?
Yeah, if I can, I may. I just want to follow up briefly before I do that, in terms of what Sajid Javid just went through. I completely agree about the natural capital accounting, because what we measure, starts to define what we then do, but it needs to be more integrated into our economic system, because currently GDP is the only thing we measure, and the only thing that is debated and seems to have importance, which means that, for example, you could take all the fish out of the sea in 1 year, and then you would end up with fantastic GDP for that year, because but at the same time the following year you wouldn't have any fish. So there's no sort of accounting of the risk in that. So it's really, really important that the finance sector starts to take account of these things. So sort of the TCFD announcement, for example, recently, allows the finance sector to report, or will enable the finance sector and the business sector to report on their risk in this area, but we haven't yet moved to the place where there's actually plans to follow up on that. So, for example, we are now calling, as I said, for the finance sector to be aligned to 1.5 degrees at the end of this year, The UK could have the first financial sector to do so, because just reporting on your risk isn't going to be enough. You've got to be mandated to make a plan and then tackle it. We've only really got 8 years to turn this around in. It's not going to be enough just to report, to do that natural capital accounting. We've got to then take action on that, which is why following up on mandatory risk reporting is so important. In terms of the CBD, it's obviously a really important moment, and what we need to do in the CBD is make sure that that 10-year target is in there, that the 10-year target, not just to preserve the nature that we've got left, but start to restore it, is put into that. And the UK is already, I know, working hard in their negotiations, putting all its diplomatic might behind making sure that that target is in the CBD. But those negotiations are currently ongoing, and it's not currently in there at the moment. So in order for it to be stronger, it needs to be in there. We also need to have a ratchet mechanism in the CBD, so that they're just like with the COP, there's an opportunity for countries to come back and commit to more. Currently, that's not in there either. So we are in a difficult situation. In order for COP26 to be a success, COP15 also needs to be a success.
Thank you. And Stanley, given the high stakes, how do you think we can build on the current momentum?
Okay, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Brilliant. So I can't see any of you now, but nevertheless I can hear you.
We can see you. So...
Now, okay, I think, as I just had an idea as we speak, what is really moving the climate issue at the moment? It is the idea of carbon border taxes, because it seems so absolutely obvious, so absolutely inevitable, and we are going to see more and more people going for that, including organisations like the G7. Now, it does seem to me that we need to have exactly the same principle also as far as biodiversity is concerned, and I think it would not be beyond the wit of diplomats and scientists and researchers and academics to devise something equivalent to carbon border taxes for biodiversity. So you have BBT, with biodiversity border taxes as well. I just tossed that idea out because I think in the end, as people have said several times here today, in the end, it's the cost of this, and the fact that there are free riders out there. That is what's driving the carbon issue, and it's the sense of free riders which also needs to drive the biodiversity issue, and I think we can get there if we start focusing on that too. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that is a very interesting point, I think, and we are fortunate enough to have a former Chancellor of the Exchequer on this call. Sajid, what's your view on this very interesting proposal?
I think Stanley and what Kate said before that, I think they're both right on this point, on what Stanley's just said about measurement of biodiversity and the example he gave with climate change. But also Kate's point, which I also want to very much agree with, where she talked about GDP and highlighting that for understandable reasons, all countries in the world, they measure their economic progress by pointing to their GDP. And it's a very valuable measure. It's really important, serves a huge purpose, and there's no taking away from that. But the one thing it does not do, and the giveaway is the name. It's gross domestic product, the change in gross domestic product. It doesn't measure depreciation, and Kate gave a good example of that. We were talking earlier about the rainforest. You could boost your GDP by deforesting at a much higher rate, and the GDP might look good, but you've destroyed a lot more natural capital in the process. And this is actually at the heart of the Dasgupta review. And if we're going to do this, what you need is every country needs to properly measure its, as I've said before, its natural capital, not just GDP. Publish that number annually, show the depreciation in it, and it needs to be done not just at the official level by official statisticians for that nation, but as Kate has rightly pointed to, by banks, by central banks, including private banks, and much more broadly as well. And to take your question, Ruth, earlier, when you began this segment about what could we see at CBD that would really sort of make a difference. I think an agreement at CBD, an international agreement that requires all countries, gets a commitment from them all to properly start measuring natural capital, showing the changes each year, which will probably start by showing depreciation, although what we all want to see is an improvement, an enhancement in natural capital, but at least getting that measurement right and having agreed standards on how to do that internationally, I think would be a huge step forward. When we can start measuring it, then we can see the true impact of the policies we implement to protect biodiversity.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to maybe a more domestic issue here raised by Monica in the chat. How do you reconcile build, mostly on greenfield and agricultural land, with nature recovery? Are you convinced by the arguments that claim we can double nature while simultaneously concreting over thousands of acres? Sajid, I'm going to stay with you for the first answer on this one. What's your view?
I think one thing you try to do is a government should try to do, starting, of course, this includes our government, is that when we are proposing, let's say, a new infrastructure project, a new road, rail links, and that when we assess what's called the cost benefit analysis of that it includes the impact of natural capital. It doesn't at the moment, right? And to a very small extent it does. And so in the UK, for example, the Treasury uses a set of rules which are collectively called the Green Book. And the Chancellor has rightly, he's been changing those rules, reviewing them, and that's all perfectly sensible thing to do. But what we should be doing in that process is also inserting rules around measuring the impact on nature of all these projects, building projects, road projects. And doesn't mean to say you shouldn't do them, but what it forces you to do is to look at properly and transparently the impact on the natural world of that project. And sometimes, of course, it will be perfectly justified. And sometimes you might think again and find a much more eco-friendly way, let's say, of achieving the same aim. So I think that kind of approach is an essential part of this.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of questions I want to get to in the next couple of minutes, so I'm going to go straight to the next one. I'm going to address that to Kate. Got a question here from Henry. If we included natural capital in our economics, as recommended by Dasgupta, how would that affect the cost of living, e.g. food prices?
Really interesting question. If I can just go a little bit back actually to the fiscal framework issue that Sajid Javid was just talking through. I think what's really important is that in order to build back greener, we have a real holistic view of where our money should be spent and what we need to be able to do that. I mean, I do know that our Prime Minister is looking at the fiscal framework at the moment. What about a net zero test and the equivalent for nature that would allow us to check where our spending is going? Because actually it's not going to cost that much money to tackle the climate and nature crisis. It's what it's about is about moving and shifting the money that we have already into the right places. So for example, not spending on a coal mine, I saw that was in one of the Q&A, but instead spending on vertical farms that would reduce the space and use of land to free that up for housing and to free that up also for nature. The important thing is that we tackle these things in a way that doesn't give us a sort of a debt for the future generations to pay in terms of housing. And the one thing we need to look at is balance all of these elements together through a fiscal framework that takes account of the value of nature and the value of our climate alongside the human capital and social capital that we have.
Thank you. Now, Stanley, you proposed a very interesting idea, and I'm going to put another interesting one to you from Peter in the chat. What are the obstacles to increasing taxes on greenhouse gas emissions and using those revenues to protect habitat, biodiversity, and nature-based solutions for carbon sequestration? You're on mute, Stanley. Oh. Still on mute, I'm afraid. All right, I tell you what, while Stanley figures that out, Sajid, I'm going to go to you instead. What is your view?
No, I think that we've rightly got a whole bunch of carbon taxes already. Oh, Stanley's back. Maybe actually,
Go
great,
on,
Stanley, over to you.
Quickly, and then Sajid. 1 minute each. Come on.
Yeah. But very quickly, it has to be done, and the metric part is absolutely vital. In many ways, the climate people have had it easy because we have been able to measure emissions, and we have been able to relate the emissions to the increase in the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. It's not so easy to do it from nature. It absolutely has to be done if we're going to get the fiscal framework right, and if we're going to get the tax measures right, which I said so before. And once we do that, then I think it will be possible to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Go on, Sajid.
Look, if I may, we're about to finish. My final comment is I think just this is so important to this issue, that biodiversity loss, it has an economic cause, it has economic consequences, and therefore it requires an economic solution. And that's why I think that this work that we refer to, the Dasgupta review, that work, the economics, understanding that the economics of biodiversity is absolutely essential for anyone that cares about this issue.
Thank you. Right, well, I've given myself about 1 minute to wrap this up. So I just want to say thank you to all our panelists for joining us today, and for everybody watching and those who are contributing in the chat and with questions as well. I think it just shows what a huge range of issues that we have here, that there is some really exciting work that's going on and some brilliant momentum that we need to build on, but still an awful lot left to do. So thank you very much for joining us, and it will be great to see where we take some of the ideas that have been floated this afternoon. Thank you.